The forest was quiet in a way only old places could be. She hadn't meant to wander this far. The trail was gone. Her map, damp and faded, useless. But something, not fear, not urgency, had pulled her deeper. Step by step. Past frozen streams, rotting trees, and silent watchful ridges. She stopped when she saw him. He stood just beyond the tree line, massive, still, and staring directly at her. No growl. No bluff. No charge. Just eyes. Dark, impossibly steady eyes. She raised her hand slowly. Not to defend. Not to run. And then, almost without realizing it, the words came. Soft. Certain. You're him. A beat of silence. Then the whisper. I know who you are. It had been exactly 4 winters since she'd last seen him. Emily had never told anyone about the bear. Not fully. Not the way it actually was. People knew she worked with wildlife rehabilitation for a time, that she'd lived near the forest, studied animal behavior, once raised a cub for release. But no one really knew. Not what that cub had meant. Not what losing him had done. She hadn't meant to keep him. In fact, the plan was always to release him. He was barely 3 weeks old when she'd found him, fur soaked in blood, limp beside his mother's collapsed body near the highway. A hit and run. Most cubs wouldn't survive the night. This one had. She named him Milo. Not because he needed a name, but because she did. The first winter, Milo slept beside a warm stove. She fed him formula with rubber gloves and sat for hours watching him crawl across the wood floors of her off-grid cabin. By spring, he was waddling after her into the woods. By summer, she stopped locking the cabin door. And then, by the second winter, she knew it was time. His instincts were kicking in. He'd begun to wander farther, explore on his own, sleep outside rather than curled beside her. When the state biologists approved his release, she agreed. Not because she wanted to, but because it was right. Bears were meant to be wild. The last morning she saw him, he had returned to the porch, sat in front of her like always. She opened the door. He sniffed her hand. She whispered, "You'll be okay." Then, he walked into the trees. She didn't know it would be the last time. The next few months were quiet. Lonely, but proud. She'd done what she was trained to do. Release and let go. But then, one morning, she saw a news clip online. Large brown bear found near Ridgepoint Farms. Aggressive. Sedated for transport. Her gut turned over. The scar on its shoulder. The coloration. It looked just like Milo. She called, emailed, drove 3 hours to the regional office. But they had already tagged and relocated the bear. Deep into state forest lands. Untrackable. They wouldn't tell her where. No one believed it was the same bear. No one wanted to listen. So she quit. She sold the cabin. She disappeared. But every winter since, she returned. Just for a few days. Just in case. She'd stand by the tree line. Leave pieces of dried fruit. Sometimes the scarf he used to chew. And every time, nothing came. Until now. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat upright in the shell of the old cabin, knees pulled to her chest, back pressed against what remained of the hearth. The place had long since fallen into quiet ruin, collapsed beams, a roof half open to the stars, and floorboards that creaked even beneath her stillness. But she couldn't bring herself to leave. Not yet. Not when the bear had been real. not when he had been real. She turned the frayed leather cord over in her hands for hours. Its texture was rough, the loop uneven from years of coiling, but the scent was still there. Pine. Smoke. Old wood. And something animal beneath it. That scent used to mean safety. Now, it felt like memory. She woke before dawn, dozing upright, a thin line of drool on her sleeve and her bones aching from cold. She moved quietly, packing only what she needed, a water flask, dried jerky, her notebook, a scarf, and the leather cord. The rest she left behind, as she had once before. At the edge of the cabin's clearing, she paused. The snow was fresh from last night's flurries, soft and untouched. No tracks. No signs. Just white. But still, she turned west. Toward the trees. Toward where he had disappeared. At first, the forest offered her nothing. No broken branches. No paw prints. Just the crunch of her own boots, the hiss of her breath in the cold, and the occasional rustle of a jay darting overhead. But then, near a rotted stump half swallowed by moss, she saw it. A claw mark. Clean. Deliberate. It carved deep into the bark of a pine at shoulder height, not in a panic, not in haste, but placed. Emily stopped and ran her fingers gently over the groove. Fresh. Moisture hadn't yet frozen inside. He was guiding her. Just like he used to do as a cub, clawing the trees when he wandered too far, leaving signals for her to find him. She'd taught him that. Just once. But he remembered. She followed. The marks weren't frequent, but they were clear. One on a leaning birch. Another on a stone where snow didn't gather. And, at one point, a tuft of fur, thick, coarse, and unmistakable, snagged on a bramble. He was moving deliberately. Not running. Leading. Like he wanted her to find something. Or maybe, someone. After 2 hours, the forest began to change. The pines gave way to a stretch of skeletal birch, all white bark and shadow, and then to a ravine, shallow but steep, carved by decades of snowmelt. She slid down the edge carefully, clutching at roots, landing hard on both feet with a grunt. At the bottom, everything was still. And then she saw it. A shape in the snow. Not a bear. Something smaller. Covered by a tangle of branches and dried grass. She stepped closer, cautious, heart climbing into her throat. It was a bundle. Fabric. Blue-gray. Molded to the earth like it had been there for a long time. She crouched and slowly pulled the branches away. A child's jacket. Faded. Ripped. The edges stiff with time and weather. She held it up carefully, hands shaking. There were initials stitched inside the collar. L.R. She didn't recognize the name. But the bear had led her here. She sat down slowly, jacket across her knees, snow soaking through her pants. What was this? A memory? A message? A warning? Or something else? She looked around. The ravine was silent. No tracks. No signs of anyone nearby. And yet, just beside the jacket, tucked between a root and stone, lay something else. A photo. Bent. Damp. Almost destroyed. But still legible. It showed a small girl standing next to a cub. A brown cub. The same shape. Same eyes. It was him. And the girl? Not Emily. Someone else. Someone with dark hair and bright eyes and a wide, toothy smile. Emily turned the photo over. Faded ink scratched into the back. Lena and Pepper, Cabin Creek, winter 2008. Her breath hitched. That was years before she found the cub. Which meant the bear hadn't just remembered her. He'd had someone before her. She sat in the snow, stunned. Had he been passed between people? Or did he keep finding them? Was he looking for something he'd lost? And if so, was he looking for Lena? Emily looked up, scanning the tree line. And there he was. High above on the ridge, near the edge of the ravine. Watching. Still. Present. As if waiting to see what she'd do with what she'd found. She stood, photo in one hand, jacket in the other. And raised her arm. No words. Just a gesture. I understand. He turned and disappeared behind the ridge. Emily scrambled up the slope after him, arms burning, boots slipping in the powder. When she reached the top, he was gone. But another claw mark was carved into the bark of a nearby tree. Pointing north. She stared at it for a long time before moving again. Not because she was afraid, but because she was beginning to see the truth. This wasn't just a trail. It was a timeline. A thread between people and places, all tied by one thing. Him. And in his silence, he was telling her the story. Not with words, but with what had been left behind. She walked for another hour before the light began to fade. She made camp beneath a leaning spruce, laying the jacket beside her like a totem, the photo folded safely inside her notebook. She didn't light a fire. She wanted him to come back. To know she'd followed. That she hadn't looked away. And just before she closed her eyes, she whispered into the cold. I don't know what I'm finding yet, but I know it matters. And somehow, she felt the trees hear her. The wind shifted with the morning, rolling in low from the north and bringing with it the smell of thawing pine bark and damp earth. Emily woke cold and stiff beneath the spruce, the child's jacket still folded beside her, heavy with unspoken meaning. The photograph remained tucked inside her notebook, and for a brief moment, she almost convinced herself it was all a dream. But the claw mark was still on the tree. The ravine still lay behind her. And the bear was still ahead. She packed slowly that morning, hands methodical but mind racing. Every question twisted into another. Who was Lena? Was she alive? Did the bear remember her the way he remembered Emily? And why had he led her to this? To grief? To proof? To a second chance? She traced the stitched initials inside the collar, LR, over and over, as if they might blink and change into her own. But they never did. The bear had carried this memory longer than she had known him. She was not his beginning. But maybe she was meant to help him find his ending. The trail grew harder. There were no more obvious claw marks. But every now and then, she found his presence etched in subtler ways, a tree stripped of snow only where something massive had brushed past, a half-frozen pawprint in a muddy patch beneath a tree's wind-shielded base, a broken limb that hadn't cracked from weather. She followed. Not fast. Not foolish. Just steady. Around midday, the forest began to shift again. The evergreens grew denser, their trunks forming crooked aisles of shadow and filtered light. And then, suddenly, without warning, she saw it. A wall. Not man-made. Not structured. But deliberate. A ring of stones. 6 feet across, covered in moss and broken branches, snow melting off it faster than the forest floor. She stopped cold. The circle wasn't accidental. It had been arranged. She moved forward slowly, heart thrumming against her ribs. At the center lay what remained of a child's toy, a small stuffed bear, waterlogged and split at the seams, one button eye missing. The thread across its belly had long unraveled. She knelt beside it, touched the fabric, felt the faint give of something still intact inside. A bell. When she pressed gently, it jingled, soft, broken, but still a sound. She sat back hard in the snow. He'd brought it here. Or maybe Lena had. But someone had buried this grief the way people bury secrets, in the wild, where no one else would understand. Except someone who could carry it. Like him. There were scratch marks on several of the surrounding stones. Short. Shallow. Purposeful. She ran her fingers along one and then looked up toward the surrounding trees. No bear. No sound. But he had been here. She could feel it in her spine. She reached into her pack, pulled out her notebook, and flipped to the photograph again. This time, she examined the background, not the girl, not the cub. The trees. One stood out. A wide cedar with a split trunk and moss climbing only one side. She looked around. And there, just beyond the ring, stood the same tree. This was the place in the photo. This was where the picture had been taken. She blinked hard, overwhelmed by the pressure of it all, the way time collapsed here, like the years between Lena and now didn't matter. Like the bear had made this clearing a shrine. Not to a person, not even to loss. But to connection. To whoever had seen him and not looked away. She sat beside the ring for hours, watching the light move across the clearing. She said nothing. Wrote nothing. Just sat. Listening. Breathing. Waiting. And near sundown, she heard it. Not a roar. Not a grunt. But a low sound, like breath through pine needles. A sound only the woods made when something was passing through. She turned. And there he was. On the opposite side of the circle. Still. Heavy. Watching. His eyes weren't wild. They were tired. Older than she remembered. But clear. So painfully clear. She rose to her feet, slowly. Held the photograph up. I found her, she said. I don't know what happened, but I found where you kept her. The bear didn't move. But his ears flicked forward. Then, slowly, he crossed into the clearing. Not toward her. Toward the ring. He stepped beside it. Lowered his head. And pressed his nose to the stuffed bear. Emily didn't speak again. She just watched. And in the space between snow and silence, she felt it. The grief. The memory. The weight he had carried across years of forest and storm and hunger. He wasn't looking for Lena anymore. He was letting her go. As dusk deepened, the bear circled the ring once, then lay down just beside it. Not touching. But near enough that his breath stirred the broken fabric. Emily sank into the snow across from him. She reached into her coat and pulled out the leather cord again. She wrapped it around the bear toy's torn paw. Tied it gently. And let it go. They sat there until the stars came. Two beings, one human, one animal, bound by a memory neither had the words for. But both could understand. The stars held for hours, sharp and silver across the forest's vaulted sky. The clearing lay in soft silence, lit only by the moon and the pale breath of two bodies, one woman, one bear, facing each other across a ring of stones and memory. Emily didn't sleep. She couldn't. The air was too charged, the moment too alive. Each exhale from the bear stirred the snow in tiny clouds, and every shift in his fur echoed louder than it should. She remained still, arms around her knees, eyes locked on the place where the toy bear lay. When she finally looked up, she found him still watching her. Not threatening. Not curious. But calm. Present. Sometime past midnight, he stood. Not with a roar or show of strength, just a slow rising of muscle and weight, a silent command in motion. He turned toward the woods. Then paused. Looked back. Just once. And waited. Emily's heart kicked against her ribs. She stood carefully, her joints stiff from cold, and stepped over the ring, not into it, not across it, but beside it, the way he had. And then she followed. The path he took wasn't a trail. There was no marked line, no trodden dirt or broken branches. Just subtle signs, the sway of a limb just brushed, the faint warmth of air where snow had been disturbed. She stayed 20 yards behind him, far enough not to intrude, close enough not to lose him. The forest changed as they moved. The trees grew taller, denser. Less daylight reached through their crowns. But it wasn't darkness she felt. It was depth. The way one feels in old cathedrals or inside someone else's dream. And then, after nearly an hour, they emerged into another clearing. This one was smaller. Hidden. Guarded by 3 ancient pines so tightly woven together that light barely touched the snow at their roots. The bear stopped just short of them. Lowered his head. Emily stepped forward, breath held, and saw what he was showing her. At the base of the middle pine, a carving. Barely visible. Faded by years of wind and bark growth. She crouched to examine it. A name. Scratched deep and uneven into the wood, Lena. Just beneath it, I'll come back. Emily's throat tightened. It wasn't the words that undid her. It was the promise. A child, maybe no more than 10, had left a vow here. And somehow, he had returned. Or maybe, he'd never left. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the photo again, and held it against the bark, lining up the background. Yes. It matched. This was their spot. This was where the photo had been taken. She looked up at the bear. His eyes weren't focused on the tree. They were on her. Watching her reaction. Measuring something in her face. She didn't speak. She only stepped forward, slowly, and pressed her palm flat against the name. Not her name. But it could have been. Because the promise wasn't just Lena's. It was hers, too. She had promised Milo she'd protect him. That she'd keep him safe. That when he was strong enough, she'd let him go, but that if he ever came back, she'd still be there. But she hadn't been. Not for him. Not even for herself. She had run. When the bear turned again and walked deeper into the trees, she followed without pause. Not because she needed to find something, but because she was ready to be found. They moved in silence for nearly an hour. Deeper than she'd ever gone. The land began to rise. Not sharply, just enough to feel it in her legs. The snow here was untouched. The world untouched. No logging, no trails, no human trash. Just old growth and wind and the slow breath of nature living on its own terms. At the crest of the hill, he stopped. Laid down. Emily came up beside him and gasped. Below them, tucked between 2 cliff walls, lay a frozen lake, black glass surrounded by white. On its far edge, nestled beneath a rise of stone, stood the remains of a shelter. An old trapper's cabin. Collapsed. Caved in. but visible. She knew it instantly. She had seen it once, years ago, marked on a map as abandoned and unreachable. But it wasn't unreachable. He had brought her here. She stepped beside him, resting one hand on the top of his shoulder. He didn't flinch. Together, they looked down at the lake. And slowly, quietly, she realized. This wasn't his trail. It was hers. The bear had never lost Lena. He had come back for her. But Emily? She had lost something else. She had lost herself. Her belief in what was real. Her trust in what mattered. Her ability to let grief live beside joy, without having to choose one or bury the other. And now, without words, without warning, without pressure, he had shown her the way back. Not to a house. Not to a person. But to truth. To the version of herself she thought had died with the last snowfall. She dropped to her knees beside him and whispered into the cold. I see you. The bear's breath moved steady beside her. I know who you are. And this time, she said it not just to him, but to herself. The slope down to the lake was steep and slick, the snow giving way in soft collapses beneath Emily's boots. She moved slowly, gripping roots, balancing against the rock face, eyes locked on the fractured cabin below. The bear took a different path, quieter, steadier, descending in a zigzag, his massive frame melting into the slope with an ease she could only envy. When they reached the bottom, she stopped just short of the lake's edge. It was frozen solid, not flat, but rippled in places where wind and refreeze had battled through the winter. Thin cracks spiraled through its surface like the lines on an aged palm, and beneath the ice, shadows moved. Not living, but fossilized, fallen branches, submerged stones, time itself held in cold suspension. Emily exhaled slowly, steam curling past her lips. The cabin was closer now. And from here, she could see it more clearly, what remained of it. Half a roof. One wall fully collapsed. A rusted stovepipe listing sideways like a broken finger. The window frames were black with rot. But the doorframe still stood. The bear didn't approach it. He stopped 10 yards back, near a low boulder, and simply sat. As if this was as far as he needed to go. As if the rest was hers to walk alone. Emily turned to him, her eyes asking a question. He didn't blink. Didn't move. But he didn't look away. So she stepped forward. Each footfall crunched against ice and snow, the kind of sound that never echoes but lives close to the ear. She brushed past a fallen beam and ducked beneath a splintered overhang, pushing her way into what remained of the shelter. The air inside was stale, not foul, but forgotten. Dust. Bark. Old leather. Charcoal long gone cold. And something else. Fabric. She crouched near the back wall, fingers tracing the frost-dark floor. There, half buried in the debris, lay a small backpack. Children's size. Sun-faded pink. Torn at one strap. Her fingers hovered before touching it. When she finally did, it crackled, stiff with ice and time. She opened it slowly. Inside, she found a plastic hairbrush with blue bristles, some broken. A pair of mittens, one crusted with sap. A crushed juice box. And a notebook, spiral-bound, water-warped, but still intact. She pulled it out, her hands trembling. Flipped open the front cover. A name written in block letters. Lena Rayner, Cabin Creek School. And then, beneath it, a line scribbled in messy crayon. If you find this, I miss my bear. Emily's eyes stung. She turned page after page, drawings of trees, of cabins, of a cub. Notes about feeding him berries. One entry titled, "Today he brought me a sock." Another, "He followed me into the water but slipped LOL. And then, abruptly, it ended. No goodbye. No final page. Just blank paper. She closed the notebook, pressed it to her chest, and sat back hard in the snow. Tears came quietly. Not for Lena, whom she had never known. Not even for the bear, who had carried this memory across the seasons. But for the years she had spent thinking she had been the only one. She turned to the doorway, toward the boulder. He was still there. Watching. Still. Patient. His fur was dusted with snow now. His head slightly lowered. Like he knew. Like he had always known. That eventually, someone would come back. Emily stood. Carried the backpack outside. She didn't take it to him. She simply set it at the cabin's threshold, like returning a book to a shelf. A promise fulfilled. A story honored. And then, as the light shifted around them and the snow softened into silence, she crossed to where he sat. The boulder beside him was wide, flat, lichen-covered. She sat on its edge. Their shoulders didn't touch, but the space between them was warm. The kind of warmth that doesn't come from body heat, but from presence. She didn't speak. Neither did he. But she let herself lean, just slightly, until her coat brushed his fur. And when he didn't move away, she let herself stay there. She reached into her own pack and pulled out her notebook. Opened to a blank page. And wrote. This was never about finding something. It was about being found. She turned the page. Wrote again. There's no one left to tell her story. So now I will. As evening neared, the light across the lake shifted. The ice cracked once, loudly, then settled. The wind changed direction. And Emily understood something she hadn't before. She was not the final stop. She was the bridge. Between the girl and the bear. Between the past and whatever came next. She turned to him. Spoke softly. I don't know if you stayed because you couldn't leave, or because you were waiting. He didn't move. Didn't answer. She smiled. I'm glad you waited. And then, as the first stars blinked into view, she whispered. I'll wait, too. The fire she built that night was small. Just a nest of dry twigs and two larger branches she'd pulled from beneath the old cabin's collapsed overhang. The flames crackled softly in the still air, orange against the snow, pushing shadows across the boulder where she and the bear sat side by side. He hadn't moved in hours. Still beside her. Still watching the lake. Still silent. But not absent. Never absent. Emily had laid the notebook from Lena carefully on her lap. She hadn't written in it since earlier that afternoon, but her fingers kept tracing the edge of the paper over and over, like she could draw meaning from the weight of the page alone. Across from her, the pink backpack still sat in the cabin's open threshold. Unclaimed. Waiting. But for what? The fire popped loudly. The bear didn't flinch. Emily looked at him again. Closer this time. The scar on his shoulder was older than she remembered, the fur around it grown gray at the edges. His eyes were the same color, but heavier now, not tired, but full. As if he'd seen more than any one life should carry. And suddenly, something inside her shifted. She realized he was not leading her anymore. He was saying goodbye. Not in the dramatic way the world expects. Not with a roar or retreat. but with stillness. With the way he stayed beside her, letting her touch his fur without fear. With the way he didn't look back at the backpack, or the name carved in the tree, or the lake. Because he'd already said his farewell. Now, he had brought her to the place where she needed to say hers. Emily stood, suddenly unsteady. She walked to the edge of the lake. The ice reflected the firelight, golden and fractured. She pulled the scarf from around her neck, the same one she had worn all those years ago the night she last saw him as a cub, and held it in both hands. She stepped carefully onto the ice. Just far enough. Then placed the scarf down, pressing it flat against the surface. She stood there a moment longer. And whispered, "Thank you." Behind her, the bear didn't move. She returned to the fire, the lake behind her now glowing softly under a crescent moon. The scarf remained visible, a bright line in a field of black. She sat down again. And this time, she rested her full weight against him. Not testing. Not waiting. Just being. He accepted it without hesitation. The fire burned low. The wind rose. And Emily closed her eyes. She wasn't sure when she fell asleep. But she knew the moment she woke. Because he was gone. The fire was ash. The sky was blue. And the snow near her side was smooth. No prints. No crushed path. Just untouched white. He had left while she slept. Silently. Gently. The way only those who understand true endings ever do. She stood quickly, spinning in every direction, scanning the treeline, the lake, the ridge above. But there was nothing. No shadow. No shape. No sound. Just wind. And cold. And stillness. Emily dropped to her knees. Not out of grief. But a strange, full emptiness. Like something had been returned to her, then set free. She stayed at the cabin for another day. She wrote in the notebook. Left pages for Lena. For Milo. For the others she'd never met, whose stories might live in dens and carvings and forgotten paths. Then she packed. One last time. But not everything. The backpack stayed. The notebook, too. And in its final page, she wrote, "If you find this." I didn't name the bear. He already had one. He just carried it in silence. Until someone finally listened. She climbed the ridge slowly, turning one last time at the top to see the lake glinting below. There was no sign of him. Not even in the snow. But she no longer needed proof. The story had already been told. By the time she reached the trailhead, the sun had dropped low, throwing long blue shadows across the path. A man in a green jacket stood there, a ranger. He looked surprised to see her. "Are you Emily?" She blinked. "Yes." He scratched the back of his head. "We got your message." She frowned. "Message?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a weather-worn scrap of paper. Her handwriting. The one she'd left weeks ago under the old signpost. The note that said, "They are safe. But they won't be forever. Come only if you're ready to believe what grief can grow." She took the paper from him, stunned. She didn't even remember writing it with such clarity. The ranger was still talking. "We thought it was. I don't know, some kind of code. But your name was on the deed to the land. We came to check." "What did you mean by they?" Emily folded the paper carefully and slid it into her coat. She looked up at the trees one last time. Smiled. And said, "Memory." The ranger's truck rattled and groaned as it bounced down the long, gravel-slick forest road, the only sound for miles apart from the occasional squawk of a distant crow or the soft ticking of melting snow dripping from the pines. Emily sat in the passenger seat, hands folded tightly in her lap, the warmth of the vehicle doing little to settle the weight in her chest. She hadn't told him everything. Not about the bear. Not about Lena. Not about the frozen lake or the carved tree or the cabin. She'd only said, "I needed to see what was left. And I found it." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't for him. The ranger, Tom, she thought his name was, glanced at her a few times while navigating a rut in the road. "You sure you don't need a hospital or anything?" She shook her head. "I'm okay. You been out there a while?" "Most people don't make it past 2 nights without a GPS beacon." "I wasn't alone," she said softly. He looked at her again, more directly this time. "Someone come with you?" She didn't answer. Just stared out the window as the trees gave way to open sky. The ranger didn't press. Maybe he'd seen that look before, the one people wore when they returned from something bigger than words could carry. Or maybe he just knew when to let silence do its job. At the ranger station, she signed her name into a form she didn't read, then refused the offered coffee and walked out before anyone else could ask more questions. There were people in the parking lot, hikers, 2 college students, a photographer wiping condensation from his lens. She passed them all without pause. They weren't looking for what she'd found. And even if they were, they wouldn't have known how to see it. That evening, she checked into a roadside motel. One of those 1-story strips with flickering signs and chipped ice machines. The woman behind the desk smiled too wide. Asked if she was getting away for the weekend. Emily nodded. Yes. Just getting away. She dropped her bag beside the bed and sat with her notebook open on the windowsill, watching the traffic buzz past. She didn't write anything. Not yet. Instead, she pulled the photograph from between the pages, the one of Lena and the cub. Her fingers brushed across the girl's face, then the bear's. She wondered if anyone else had ever seen this photo. Wondered if Lena had ever shown it to someone before she vanished, or if it had stayed buried in the pack for years, waiting for a stranger to understand it. Emily turned it over. On the back, beneath the original ink, she wrote a single new line. "I found him." Then slid the photo back into her notebook. The next day, she drove into town. No plan. Just impulse. She found a public library with a computer lab and sat down at one of the aging monitors. Googled the name, Lena Rayner. Dozens of results popped up, none recent. Mostly old-school bulletins, community newsletters, a missing persons forum from 2012. One article caught her eye. Local girl still missing, for years after vanishing near family cabin. She clicked. Read it 3 times. The family had stopped speaking publicly after the first 2 winters. A brother had moved out of state. The mother passed away in 2019. No sightings. No recovery. Just silence. Emily leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes. They'd never know what really happened. Never know he'd carried her memory. Not in a photo. Not in a collar. But in the place he built beneath the trees. She opened a new tab. Started typing. There was a bear who waited. Then stopped. Deleted the sentence. Tried again. There was a girl who made a promise. And a bear who remembered. Still not right. She wasn't trying to write a story. She was trying to hold space for something that had never had one. That night, she went to the post office. Bought a single stamped envelope. Inside it, she placed a copy of the photograph, reprinted at the motel. A short letter. You may never believe this. But he remembered her. He kept her things safe. He waited longer than anyone should. And when he was ready to let her go, he made sure someone was there to see it. She didn't sign it. Just addressed it to a name she found in the article, Daniel Rayner, the brother. Folded the envelope shut. Mailed it. And walked away. No one would believe it. She knew that. But that wasn't the point. It had never been about being believed. It had been about bearing witness. About telling the truth, even if no one could hear it but the wind. She didn't return to the forest after that. Didn't need to. He was no longer there. Or maybe he was. But his purpose had been fulfilled. The child remembered. The weight released. The silence shared. And Emily? She no longer felt haunted. She felt seen. Not by the world, but by something older, wilder, wiser. Something that had never needed words to say everything. Months passed. Not in the way time used to pass for Emily, marked by meetings, holidays, lists, and routines, but in quiet seasons now, measured by the tilt of light and the subtle ways the body remembers where it's been. She didn't go back to the forest. But she thought about it every day. The ridge. The frozen lake. The pink backpack in the cabin doorway. And him, always him, the bear with Lena's past and her own silence stitched into his footsteps. Spring came slowly to the valley. The snows retreated in waves, leaving behind matted earth, broken twigs, and patches of green like breaths returning after a long-held hush. She spent her days walking now, not to get anywhere, but to stay close to something. Something real. People noticed the difference. Neighbors nodded more. The grocer asked about her smile. Even the mailwoman, who never lingered before, once asked, "You've been somewhere, haven't you?" Emily only replied, "I went where I had to." She started writing again. Not for a publisher. Not for readers. But for Lena. For the bear. For the girl who had once whispered, "I'll come back." And for the bear who never stopped waiting. She kept it simple. Just entries in a fresh notebook, dated with the moon, the wind, the smell of pine on a given morning. She titled it, "The Ones Who Wait." One day in late May, a small, brown envelope arrived. No return address. Inside, a single note, handwritten, uneven. "I remember the scarf. Thank you for letting him let go. Dr." No name. Just the initials. Emily folded the letter gently and placed it in the back of her notebook. She didn't need more than that. The truth had moved. Been carried. Passed forward. Later that week, she drove out to a little arts co-op in a nearby town. The kind of place with old barnwood walls and hand-thrown mugs lined up in rows, each slightly imperfect in ways that made them feel more alive. On the far end of the room, tucked between a stack of field journals and cedar-scented candles, she found a set of handmade carvings. Wooden animals. A fox. A deer. And at the center, a bear. Small, plain, but the eyes, they were carved with a weight no artist should have been able to capture from imagination alone. She picked it up. Turned it in her hands. And saw, burned faintly into the base. Mr. She bought it. No questions asked. Placed it on her windowsill when she got home, where the morning sun hit it just right. One night, after a heavy rain, she stepped out onto her porch. The air smelled like earth and something faintly sweet. In the yard, a wild thing moved, just a shape. Not a bear. A fox, maybe. Or a young buck. She couldn't tell. But she didn't turn on the light. She just stood there in the dark. Let the creature pass. Let the silence settle. Let herself exist in the stillness without needing to name it. Then she whispered into the night. I didn't name you. You already had a name. And she smiled. Because she knew, somewhere beyond the ridges and lakes and years, he'd heard her. The world would go on, cars and calls and digital noise. People would forget the girl in the woods. They'd forget the man who carved initials into old pine. They'd never even know the bear who carried silence longer than most carry breath. But Emily would remember. And that would be enough. Paw Print's final scene. Weeks later, a hiker wandered deep into the ridge trails, not lost, just curious. He stumbled across a quiet cabin ruin beside a thawing lake. Found an old backpack, faded pink, resting in the doorway. Inside it, a notebook. He opened it. The pages were full. Letters to someone no longer there. Sketches of paw prints. Notes about a scarf on the ice. A line circled 3 times. If you are quiet long enough, the ones who wait will find you. He sat in the doorway, the notebook in his lap, wind brushing the lake. And listened. Just in case.